In this video, I'm about to show you 10 frozen pizza brands you should never buy and why, along with a full ranking from worst to best based on taste, crust quality, ingredients, and overall value, starting with number 10, Celeste Frozen Pizza. You can usually tell what kind of experience you're about to get from a frozen pizza before you even open the box. And with Celeste, that signal is pretty clear. It's not trying to position itself as a better pizza night option. It's positioned more like a backup plan, something you grab when the goal is simply to have something in the freezer rather than something you're actually looking forward to eating. And that distinction matters more than people think. In the frozen pizza market, brands don't all compete on the same level. Some are built to mimic restaurant-style quality, some aim for a balance between cost and taste, and then there are brands like Celeste that are structured around staying at the lowest possible price point. Once a product is designed for that tier, every decision from ingredients to portion size to overall construction gets shaped by cost control first, not flavor experience. From a consumer perspective, this is where expectations quietly shift. You're not evaluating it the same way you would a higher-end frozen pizza. You're already anticipating something basic, something that just needs to be fine enough. And companies understand that. When expectations drop, the pressure to improve does too. So Celeste doesn't really lose in this ranking because it's trying and failing. It ranks at the bottom because it's not trying to compete in the first place. It exists to fill a very specific role: low cost, low expectation convenience. And once you recognize that, it becomes clear why it lands exactly where it does, right at the bottom of the list. Number 9. Totino's Frozen Pizza. Totino's doesn't really enter the conversation as a pizza comparison. It shows up more like a category of its own. You're not putting it next to better frozen pizzas and debating flavor or texture. Most of the time, it's chosen in a completely different mindset, where expectations are already lowered before you even turn on the oven. And that's where its position in this ranking becomes clear. Compared to something like Celeste, Totino's actually feels more intentional in how it's built. It leans heavily into being quick, cheap, and easy to prepare, and in that sense, it does its job efficiently. But once you move beyond that and start comparing it to higher-ranked brands, the limitations become hard to ignore. The structure itself is where it struggles the most. It doesn't really deliver that layered pizza experience, with crust, sauce, and cheese working together. Instead, everything feels compressed into a single, flat outcome that prioritizes speed and simplicity over depth or balance. From a consumer angle, this is where the trade-off becomes obvious. You're not just saving money, you're stepping into a completely different tier of food experience. And brands like Totino's are fully aware of that. They're not trying to bridge that gap, they're designed to exist within it. So while it edges slightly above Celeste for being more consistent and purpose-driven, it still sits near the bottom because it never really aims to deliver what most people think of as a satisfying pizza experience. Number 8. Red Baron Frozen Pizza. Some frozen pizza brands don't feel like they belong in the cheap or bad category. They seem to be trying to be taken more seriously than that. Red Baron sits right in that space. It's not the lowest tier, and it definitely isn't the top either, but it's positioned in a way that makes you expect a bit more than what you actually get. From a consumer behavior perspective, this is a classic mid-shelf strategy. The branding, packaging, and overall presence are designed to signal a reliable pizza option, especially for households that want something consistent in the freezer. And to be fair, it delivers a more structured experience than ultra-budget brands like Totino's or Celeste. The crust tends to hold better, and the overall build feels more like an actual pizza rather than a flat, uniform snack. But here's where the ranking logic becomes important. Being better than the worst is not the same as being good. Once you compare Red Baron to higher-ranked frozen pizzas, the gap becomes obvious. The flavor profile is fairly safe, almost predictable. It doesn't really push any strong identity in sauce depth or cheese richness. Everything is balanced in a way that avoids failure, but also avoids standing out. And that's the real consumer reality here. Brands in this middle zone often succeed because they don't disappoint badly, not because they genuinely impress. They rely on being dependable enough that people keep buying them without thinking too hard about alternatives. So Red Baron earns its place above the lowest tier, but it stays stuck in that safe but forgettable zone where nothing goes wrong, but nothing really sticks either. Number 7. Tony's Frozen Pizza. Tony's is one of those frozen pizza brands that feels like it was built with one very clear priority: keep it accessible to almost everyone, no matter the budget. And when you look at it through that lens, a lot of things about it start to make sense. This isn't a brand trying to compete in the premium frozen pizza experience space. It's more about being widely available and affordable enough to become a default option in many households. That kind of positioning usually comes with a very specific trade-off. Consistency and cost control become more important than depth of flavor or ingredient quality. Compared to something like Red Baron, Tony's feels a step more basic in execution. The structure is there, it looks like a pizza, it bakes like a pizza, but the experience is very straightforward. Nothing really stands out strongly. The sauce, cheese, and crust all exist in a very functional balance rather than anything memorable or layered. From a consumer perspective, this is where you can see how pricing quietly shapes expectations. When something is priced lower, people naturally stop expecting complexity. They expect something good enough for hunger, not something they would actively choose for taste. And brands like Tony's understand that dynamic very well. They're not trying to win taste comparisons against higher-tier frozen pizzas. They're competing on availability, affordability, and repeat purchase behavior. That's why it stays relevant, even if it doesn't stand out. So in this ranking, Tony's lands above the lowest tier because it is at least consistent and functional, but it still sits in the lower half because it never really moves beyond basic execution into anything genuinely satisfying or distinctive. Number 6. DiGiorno Frozen Pizza. There's a reason DiGiorno gets talked about more than most frozen pizza brands. It doesn't behave as it belongs in the same category as budget freezer options. The whole idea behind it is built around one simple psychological trick: making you feel like you didn't just cook frozen pizza, but actually made something closer to delivery-style pizza at home. That rising crust concept isn't just marketing fluff. It's a real product design choice that aims to mimic the expansion of fresh dough in the oven. And compared to lower-tier brands like Tony's or Celeste, you can genuinely see the difference in structure. It's thicker, more layered, and clearly engineered to look more restaurant-like. But here's where the consumer reality kicks in. Big frozen brands like DiGiorno are extremely good at controlling perception. The packaging, the baking experience, even the smell coming out of the oven, all of it is designed to sell the feeling of upgrade. And to be fair, it does succeed at that level. Where it falls short in a ranking like this is when you strip away the expectation and just judge taste balance. The richness can feel heavy, and instead of subtle layering of flavors, it often leans into a more intense, filling profile. So DiGiorno sits in an interesting space. It's not basic, it's not cheap feeling, but it's also more about recreating the idea of pizza night than delivering a truly refined frozen pizza experience. Number 5. Tombstone Frozen Pizza. Nobody really walks into a frozen aisle thinking, I'm excited for Tombstone. And that itself tells you a lot about where this brand sits in the hierarchy. It's not built for excitement, it's built for recognition. Tombstone has been around long enough that it feels more like a known option than a selected experience. People don't evaluate it like they would a new or premium frozen pizza. It exists in that mental category of I already know what this will be like, and that familiarity does most of the selling. From a consumer reality perspective, this is how a large portion of mid-tier food brands survive. They don't win through hype or upgrades. They win through predictability. You don't have to think twice. And that's the entire value proposition. Compared to DiGiorno, which tries to create a full-on pizza night illusion, Tombstone is stripped down. No dramatic positioning, no fresh-baked transformation narrative. It's thinner, simpler, and more direct in how it presents itself. But that simplicity is a double-edged thing in a ranking like this. On one side, it avoids disappointment because expectations are never artificially raised. On the other side, it also means the product rarely leaves any lasting impression. The taste, texture, and overall experience remain within a very controlled, familiar range with little variation. So Tombstone ends up occupying a very specific space. Not impressive enough to climb higher, but stable enough to stay above the truly basic budget tier options. It doesn't compete by trying to be better. It competes by never changing the expectation in the first place. Number 4. California Pizza Kitchen. California Pizza Kitchen's frozen line is where things start to feel noticeably different from the lower tiers. You can tell immediately it's no longer in the cheap freezer filler category. There's a clear attempt here to bring a restaurant identity into a frozen product, and that alone changes how people approach it. From a consumer perspective, this is where expectations actually rise before the pizza even goes into the oven. The branding carries a kind of "we already know pizza" confidence, because it's tied to a restaurant name people associate with casual dining rather than mass-produced frozen food. That association matters more than most people admit. It sets a mental price and quality expectation instantly. Compared to something like Tombstone or DiGiorno, California Pizza Kitchen leans much more into flavor combinations and ingredient styling. You start seeing more variety in toppings, slightly more intentional balance in sauce and cheese, and a clearer effort to replicate a crafted pizza experience rather than just a standard frozen product. But here's the interesting part in a ranking context. Higher expectations can also expose flaws more easily. When a brand positions itself closer to premium casual dining, consumers become more critical. Small issues in texture or consistency that might be ignored in lower-tier pizzas suddenly feel more noticeable. So CPK earns its place near the top because it clearly pushes beyond basic frozen pizza standards, aiming to deliver something closer to a restaurant-style experience at home. But it still sits just below the very top tier because, despite the branding and variety, it doesn't always fully replicate the depth and freshness you'd expect from an actual made-to-order pizza experience. Number 3. Amy's Kitchen Frozen Pizza. Amy's Kitchen doesn't feel like it belongs in the same aisle conversation as most frozen pizzas. It feels more like it was placed there for a completely different type of shopper, someone already suspicious of the usual frozen food experience. And that difference shows up immediately in how people approach it. With most frozen pizzas, the decision is quick and price-driven. With Amy's, the decision is slower and more intentional. People actually pause, read the box, look at ingredients, and think about what they're putting into their body in a way they usually don't with frozen food. That alone changes the product's role. Instead of competing on big flavor impact or heavy toppings, Amy's leans into a quieter kind of value, simpler formulations, more recognizable ingredients, and a less processed feel overall. It's not trying to dominate your taste buds. It's trying to reduce the feeling of artificiality that people associate with frozen meals. But here's the interesting part in a ranking like this. When a product is built around restraint, it changes how you judge it. You don't evaluate it the same way you would a standard frozen pizza anymore. You start evaluating it as a food choice decision, which brings entirely different expectations to the experience. So Amy's earns its position near the top not because it feels the most indulgent, but because it consistently shifts the frozen pizza experience away from pure convenience eating and closer to something people feel more deliberate about choosing. Number 2. Newman's Own Frozen Pizza. Newman's Own sits at the top of this ranking not because it tries the hardest to look like frozen pizza done right, but because it consistently feels like it understands what people actually expect when they buy frozen food at this level. There's a very specific consumer perception attached to this brand. The name itself already carries recognition outside just the frozen aisle, and that changes how people approach it. You're not treating it like a random budget option or a generic freezer item. You're already expecting a slightly more thoughtful product experience before it even goes into the oven. What stands out in practice is balance. The crust doesn't feel overly engineered. The sauce tends to avoid that overly artificial sharpness you get in lower-tier pizzas. And the overall composition feels like it was designed with eatability in mind rather than just shelf survival. It doesn't rely on gimmicks like exaggerated thickness or overdone cheese layers to create impact. From a consumer behavior angle, this is where trust plays a big role. When a brand consistently delivers a stable experience, people stop questioning it. They don't compare every bite, they just assume it will deliver a certain baseline quality. That reliability is a huge advantage in a category where many products swing between okay and disappointing. Compared to everything lower in the ranking, Newman's Own doesn't feel like it's chasing extremes. It doesn't try to be the cheapest or the most indulgent. Instead, it sits in that rare space where consistency, balance, and general satisfaction actually align. So it earns the top spot, not because it reinvents frozen pizza, but because it quietly does the fundamentals better than everyone else on this list without overstating what it is. Number 1. Freschetta Frozen Pizza. Freschetta is one of those frozen pizza brands that doesn't really shout for attention in the aisle, but when you actually get into the comparison game, you start noticing it behaves differently from most mid to high-tier options. Unlike brands that rely heavily on pizza night hype marketing or overly dramatic positioning, Freschetta feels more focused on delivering a structured, well-balanced frozen pizza experience. It's the kind of product that quietly aims to reduce the usual weak points people associate with frozen food, like soggy crusts or overly artificial tasting sauces. From a consumer perspective, this is where things get interesting in terms of ranking. Freschetta doesn't win because it feels like restaurant pizza. It wins because it reduces disappointment. That sounds simple, but in frozen food categories, consistency is a major advantage. People don't always remember the best bite, but they definitely remember when something turns out worse than expected. Compared to something like Newman's Own, Freschetta performs very similarly, but with a slightly more engineered feel. The structure tends to be more controlled, with crust, cheese, and toppings arranged in a way that feels designed for even baking and predictable results, rather than rustic or casual variation. And that predictability is exactly why it earns a top position in this ranking. It doesn't depend on hype, branding, emotion, or surprise factor. It depends on delivering a stable experience that feels familiar every single time. So Freschetta lands near the top because it represents a very specific kind of frozen pizza success. Not the most exciting, not the most talked about, but one of the most consistently reliable options when you judge purely on overall execution.